Persuading people to take the actions we want can be hard. Our teams and clients are bombarded with thousands of messages every single day. But there is a way for you to get above the noise. Stories. This is the Stories with Traction podcast, and I'm your host, Matt Zaun. Join my guests and me as we unpack the power of storytelling. We'll talk about topics like leadership, sales, and marketing, all through the lens of strategic storytelling. Enjoy this episode. Podcasting. It's a topic of conversation that continues to come up again and again. How do you start? What do you talk about? How do you learn how to interview? What technology do you use? And I appreciate all the questions. And this podcast, the Stories with Traction podcast, has been great. It's allowed me to meet incredible guests and unpack topics with them that I know my audience appreciates. But I am not a podcast expert. That's why I wanted to bring on Ryan Sullivan so he could share ideas regarding podcast strategy. Ryan Sullivan is the founder of Podcast Principles, where he helps people launch top 1% podcasts with zero paid promotion using a proven launch strategy tailored specifically to turn audience members into podcast fans. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Matt, thank you so much for doing this, man. Excited to be here, and we've spoken a few times before, but really excited to dive in, get a little bit more specific on who we're talking about and who podcasting is good for in this on this interview, man. So I'm always happy to be on a podcast. I always say I try to take all requests for the show. So thanks, man. Appreciate it.
And I very much appreciate our conversations. We've spoken numerous times, and every time we talk, I learn something. In fact, I learn a lot. And I'm of the mindset of learn, do, adjust, and continue to learn, continue to do, adjust along the way. And I've gotten a lot of that from you, taking ideas that you have regarding podcasting, immediately applying them, and figuring out how to make it work. So I very much appreciate our conversations. And podcasting it's a hot topic right now. And what's interesting is I started this podcast a little over a year ago, was definitely fumbling along the way, trying to figure it out. And what's interesting is after a few episodes, people start to ask me all these questions regarding podcasting. And in my mind, I'm thinking, I'm still trying to figure it out myself. I'm not an expert on podcasting, right? So I think it's good to talk with someone that is an expert on podcasting. You've done this day in and day out. You've helped numerous individuals elevate themselves to influencer level status. They have an idea. How do you get it out into the world in a big, big way? And a lot of that's based on what you've done with podcasting. So I do want to dive in, obviously talk about podcasting in general, but then start talking more about strategy. So for everyone listening, before you close out of this podcast yourself, before you pause, before you click the X, even if you don't have any intention of starting a podcast, Ryan and I will actually be talking about how you can still leverage podcasting. So there is a piece on that we will absolutely cover in a little bit. But let's just start with podcasting in general. So for everyone listening right now that they have something to say, they may have thought about starting a podcast, but for whatever reason, they have not started, thinking it's a major mountain to climb. What advice, what words of encouragement would you give them to really start the process of launching their own podcast?
Great question. I'd love to, go into all the benefits of podcasting. I really would, but I do want to paint this picture where the barrier to entry in podcasting seems to be work, just kind of standard, like doing the edits, creating the content, repurposing it, writing your blog post, doing your transcription, promotion. How many times are you going to promote one episode? How do you re-promote old episodes? I can go off on a list of like 100 things, right? So I do first like to set context of you don't have to be the one doing all of this, but somebody's going to have to. And it's very rare to see a podcast that just releases on Spotify, Apple, maybe even YouTube, but then doesn't do any of the promotional side and then just becomes, a top 100 podcast. It just doesn't happen. Now,
sure,
I'm agnostic to your promotional style, right? I personally use organic content. That's what I'm better at than anything else. I don't do paid ads, right? I do guest spots and organic content. I even email. I'm just getting into it after podcasting for 4 years, starting an email list. I don't have a community yet, right? So I'm speaking from what's worked for me and what's worked for my clients. There are the same way there's 100 things that need to happen in your podcast. There's 100 ways to promote it too, and there's probably 100 that work. So I was asked on a podcast the other day, what's the one marketing marketing tactic that you fundamentally disagree with? And the answer is there isn't one. If it works, I agree with it that it works. I just might not do it myself. But I just like to paint that picture of, first, it's going to be a lot of work. Now I can go into the details of what that looks like, whether you're going to do it or somebody else is going to do it. If you're just the talent and you can outsource the other stuff, that's going to help your content, right? So we got to look at what the work is. So it's a time investment, it's a money investment. And then I think the big one, what I consider the 60-40 or the 70-30, you should be spending most of your time, the 60 or 70% of the time, promoting the thing, right? It's my Ferrari dealership example. I can have a Ferrari dealership. I can price all of the Ferraris at $5,000. But if nobody knows that that dealership exists, nobody's going to come get this really cheap Ferrari, right? So I consider podcasting to be similar. You can have the best content in the world, but if you're not bringing it to people and really doing the work to sell it on why they need this podcast and really the value, then nobody's going to find it. And so those are just that's the picture I like to paint up front, which is the work, the time investment, the money investment, and then the promotional side of it. And, so anybody looking to go in, just know that I can go off on an hour on the benefits because podcasting has changed my life, and, we could go into that. But I really do like to paint this picture now because there is no, poof, here's my fans, right? It really is that day-to-day work and who's going to be doing that,
Sure. So I very much appreciate you mentioned that, because I appreciate you being open and honest and shooting everyone straight, that instead of just saying, oh, it's easy, it's a cakewalk, hey, just start it. I very much appreciate you at least laying the foundation that it does take work. It absolutely takes work. And a lot of times more work than some people may even realize. However, the
most
reward
of the time, sorry to cut you off, but I'd say most of the time, and I think even you, Matt, right? Like your experience, you have a business, you're successful, right? But for you that you could map out your whole podcast, and for you there was things that you could have never predicted that you had to do, and uploads that disappeared. And it's just, you could even plan. You could, we're really about planning and systems and structure, but even for the most dialed in human being, man, there's gonna be some things that get you caught up,
So, all right. So yes, let's talk about that. You had mentioned downloads that disappeared. So there's a ton of frustration with it. There's a ton of frustration. I was just telling you before we hopped on this that I had a really good setup, and I had a lot of IT issues recently where I had to revamp all my stuff. I bought a new microphone. I bought a new computer because I had software issues with what I was using before, hours and hours with IT and all these different things. So yes, it can be extremely frustrating. So people that are interested recognize that it does take work. Now, there's some benefits to this. A lot of benefits. Actually, one of the things that you had mentioned that I found fascinating and very spot on is a lot of times people say, is it an oversaturated medium? Is the competition so much competition, I can't get my voice out there? And back to what you have said numerous times, that it takes so much work to do it that you don't even really need to worry about about competitors, because this is not posting on social media. It's not like you could just click and post something. Like, there's more that goes into it, which really boxes out a lot of people from doing this. So that's an advantage that people have. If they're willing to work, they're willing to figure out strategy, they're gonna experience so many different rewards, and they don't need to worry about people that are going to be lazy and not actually do it.
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
Yeah. So I learned that from you, because when I first started it, my thought was there's going to be so much competition out there, and there is, but eventually people that want to work continue to work and continue to build out their audience for sure.
Yeah. And I just love when people say that, because sure, what you mentioned is a benefit, that maybe less people will go into it because they might think it's saturated. But it's funny that people are commenting talking to me about this on my post on LinkedIn that has like hundreds of millions of users that they think is going to grow their brand, where then they look at podcasting with 4 million podcasts. Like, you're posting on a platform that's by anybody's definition saturated. If you're posting on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, or LinkedIn, those are saturated. If you want to talk saturation, so in terms of the amount of people making content, so it's just funny that there's like, it really comes down to how you look at these things, right?
Sure.
I think objectively, if you look at podcasting, it's obviously not saturated. Like, if you look at like, okay, how many are there? How many release consistently? How many then are in my category? Within my category, how many are in my exact niche? Within my niche, how many are actually getting X amount of downloads? Like, if you just did the objective view and looked at the numbers, it would prove to you that it's not saturated. So I think that's always a fun one for me to make that LinkedIn post and let people know about every 2 months the reality of the situation of like, hey, I looked 2 years ago and it wasn't saturated. 2 years later, there's a million more podcasts, but it's still not. So it comes back to the barrier to entry being work. It's very easy to make a Facebook profile. It's pretty hard. It takes a lot more work to make one podcast episode.
Very true. I very much like that. So barrier of entry is work. Now, what about the reward? Talk to us about why would anyone do this?
I'll tell you why I do it first. And I say this because I don't think it's going to relate to most people in terms of what their benefits are going to be, just in terms of who we're speaking with or speaking to today. But for me personally, there's no other feeling. There's no better feeling that I get than sitting down with somebody for a couple hours and just talking to them and hearing their story, especially if I haven't met them before. It's just it's an emotional experience for me. I feel like it's a cheat code in life. I get to sit down with people and just ask them how they did X, Y, or Z, ask the tough questions. 2 examples I'll bring up. The first is a friend of mine who tragically, unfortunately, passed away in a car accident. And he was on my show probably about a year and a half before that. We were planning on he was planning on being on again a few months after the accident took place timeline wise, and his family reached out to me and said like, hey, thank you for recording this podcast with him, because now we have, like, as much as you guys sound like idiots, because we're 19 years old, they now have that 2 hours of him just talking forever. So, and then another example was much more recent, is my friend Alex, who lost his leg in a tragic accident when he was 16. And I was able to talk to him for a half an hour about that experience. And if I saw him on the street, there's no way I'm having that conversation, right? So, and the content that comes out of these conversations obviously is, different than your standard B2B business podcast, right? So that's why I like to come from my own experience first. And that's why I do it. I don't need numbers, downloads. I don't need to make my money back on my podcast. I do it for straight personal reasons. In terms of a business context, there's a plethora, right? First, I think content's the big one, but content that isn't boring. Like, a lot of company content is like a lot of company content. And if yours smells and looks like the next guy, then what are you even doing it for? Mm-hmm. And I had even a post today that, how I look at this, what you're doing with a podcast is you're building demand for something that has nothing to do, or almost nothing to do, with what you sell, your product or service. You want to build demand and an audience for your content. That, for me personally, or how I look at it, is the foundation of demand generation. Because remember, I don't run ads. I do all organic, all audience building organically, right? So you want to build demand for your content. Once you do that, you have an audience. They're like, once they have the need, they're just automatically going to buy from you, right? Because they just love taking the value from your content. And if you're on LinkedIn, Chris Walker is a great example. He comes up all the time, but he's a great example, right? He's always giving you game. And it's all opinions about the industry. It's all, this is what we saw. This is what people are doing wrong, right? It's this thought leadership type of content. So if you're a CEO or C-level, you gotta, first of all, you probably have a ton of opinions in there that you don't even know what's what, right? You don't even know how to transfer your expertise and your energy into a podcast. If you do, great. But you got to figure that out first. But you're really going to develop this thought leadership that only comes from developing an audience. And so that's how I look at the major benefits of the thought leadership, which ties into content. Now it can be most of your company content, because you can break down a podcast from the long form video and the long form audio. That gets transcribed, so then you have your transcription. You're having a guest on. Matt right now can use what I said, my likeness, everything, and put it on his website and quote me, and now use me and drive SEO to his website. If I blow up and and I have 10 million followers tomorrow, his episode with me is always on Spotify and Apple Podcasts forever. So you're able to take somebody's experience and all their information and then just use it for yourself. So that's another massive one. So those are just a few, but I like to start with the content. Let's shift our mindset, thought leadership, build an audience. Don't worry about selling, worry about value, right? And then also the content benefits of, literally this can be most of the content for your business, for sure. And there's many other benefits: guesting, connections, referrals, partnerships, sponsors, the monetization benefits, which I haven't even touched on, but those are a couple just to start.
Sure. All right. So let's go through the why behind it, because what you just mentioned is massive why. Okay. And you mentioned personal and professional. So let's tackle the personal. So I very much appreciate you mentioned those two stories regarding your two friends. That's extremely powerful, what you just said. And I don't want people to miss out on that. There's a lot that can come from the personal why behind this. For me personally, and to go a little bit deeper here with this, is I often think of my children. So I have three young kids, and they're constantly asking me questions about different things that happened in the past, different experiences. And I answer those questions in the moment. But when I am gone one day, whenever that is, in 5 years or 50 years from now, all the content that I've built, I want my two sons and daughter to look at that, be able to listen to something where they can hear all these stories. They can hear all the different values that I've had throughout my life and all the guests that I've had on to unpack the elements of those values. So I know that sounds pretty deep from a why perspective, but for me, I do question when I do launch something into the world, is it something that my children can get value out of in the years ahead? If it's not, I don't produce it. There have been numerous episodes where I won't launch because in my mind, I'm thinking this is not as valuable as I need it to be, not only for my audience, but also for my own family. So I think the personal why is huge. In addition, we become better communicators through podcasting. I've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of talks between workshops and keynotes and lunch and learns and every single variation of in-person speeches that one can give. And I will tell you, podcasting has radically improved my ability to communicate, even with the background of speaking on stage. Quite often, podcasting has given me another layer of being able to ask questions, being able to listen, to respond, and not necessarily to react, and to really connect with my audience. And that's helped me out in a big, big way when it comes to keynotes and when it comes to workshops as well. So that's a big personal why. The professional why that you talked about is it is a supercharger when it comes to networking, because reciprocity kicks in, where basically you have a guest on your episode and now they want to help you, and then you work together to help each other out. So it's incredible when it comes to networking. It's also really good when it comes to that connection, when it comes to giving people an ability, an opportunity to reach out to someone that would never return their phone call otherwise. Now you're offering them value, right? So it breaks down barriers. So, I mean, we can go on and on and on all day about all the different rewards that come from it. But I want people to recognize, even though, and again, I appreciate, Ryan, you painting the true picture for us, that it does take significant work, the reward is huge. The reward is absolutely huge. And then once you understand, here's what I need to do, here's the reward I can get, now you build strategy around it. And that's where you come in, right? You have a lot of different elements of strategy that you can help people with.
Yeah, so and that's where we start. We start with the why. Even when we talk to people, there is the first thing that we do with anybody is we have five. It used to be called 5 questions. Now it's 7. But it's we call it the 7 questions. Super simple, but it really asks the core fundamental questions of why are you doing this? Exactly what we just talked about. Well, why are you doing this personally? Why are you doing this professionally? Is this directly tied to your business? Is it indirectly tied to your business? Is it completely separate from your business? We really try to get down as to why this person's doing it. And a lot of times they know, but they've never answered that question.
Mhm.
They're just jumping in. They're ready to go. And that's great. I love the enthusiasm, but we really do need to set that. And I'll give you one more practical thing about the why too. Cause this why concept and like, it's not woo woo, but it's kind of on the edge. It's really important to me for sure. But if you want a practical side, it's really hard to stop something when you tie it to, in your case, your children, people, this kind of personal anchor point. It's really hard to get lazy about a podcast that's for 50 years from now, right? So if you want to get practical about the why, it is legitimately logical in terms of it's going to make sure, if you're just like, yeah, this is just for our content, man, like it's just to put something out in the feed, you're going to stop in 6 weeks, like 100%. It's going to only help you to tie it to the why. But just to open the door on strategy here, we start with really developing the ideal listener. And this is not, I'm so much more concerned with belief systems these days than personas and demographics. I don't think that you can take a 25-year-old, white male or whatever, 27-year-old Spanish female or whatever, and put them into this box of like, this is the person that we need to target with this podcast. I don't think that always works. Totally could, right? If you have a health podcast for people in their 20s, now we've segmented demographically and it makes sense. But I think a lot of times, or at least what I'm really trying to push clients to do is really think about the belief system around who this person is that could be listening or benefiting from this, right? So we're focused in on that, and that helps us create a content framework. We don't start with episodes. We start with ideas. Because if you don't have ideas, you're not going to have a good episode, right? You almost have to reverse engineer it. Like, what's the core fundamental idea here or the outcome? And then we can go make an episode about it. I think people jot down like episode 1, this, episode 2, this. Like, I like to start with the beliefs and the ideas. Like, what are these beliefs and ideas that only you have? And then how do we then turn them in to episodes? My whole thing with this is I'm not trying to create a podcast. I'm trying to take ideas and opinions and beliefs and learnings and outcomes and turn them into a podcast. The podcast ends up being the vehicle, right? The podcast is the bridge between you and the listener. I'm not like so obsessed with the idea of the podcast. You could not record the thing and it's still going to be valuable. So that's where we start with strategy. We start with these ideas and these beliefs, and then we can get into the nitty gritty of maybe what episodes look like. We have an entire framework for the description, intro, outro, all those kind of show elements is what we call them. But that's where we start with people typically.
All right. So there's a lot to unpack with what you just said, because I think what you said was extremely valuable and I don't want people to miss it. So one of the things that you said that I think is extremely important is you said ideal listener, belief system versus persona. So let's unpack that for a second, just in the event there are people listening that don't truly understand the persona element. So there's a lot of talk regarding ICP, ideal client persona. And to me, that is different generations, different boxes that people check. So as an example, most of my clients are either baby boomers or Gen Xers. The overwhelming majority of my clients have children. Knowing this is really important for me from a storytelling perspective, because I know that I need to speak to different generations. I also need to, I share a lot of stories regarding my children with business principles intertwined. So that's really good. But I think what you said goes even deeper to the heart of the issue about belief systems, because you could have baby boomers out there. Now, most of the baby boomers I work with are very high achievers. A lot of them are C-suite, a lot of them are VPs. So they're responsible for a lot, and they're responsible for a lot of lives under their leadership. That is a different belief system than a baby boomer that isn't very interested in business, that could care less and may not even be employed, right? They're not, one doesn't make the person good or bad. It's just a complete different belief system that one may have. So I appreciate you mentioning that. That's extremely important to recognize, because a lot of people are focused on personas. So once they figured it out, then they can take another step about not starting with the episode, but starting with ideas. And I love this. So let's talk about, from a simplistic perspective, I'll just randomly pull an example out of thin air. there is, let's say, a marketing company. So there's a small marketing company, and instead of having episode 1, episode 2, would they think of different marketing ideas and then reach out to guests that fit within those different marketing topics? Is that what you're referring to regarding the ideas?
Yeah, I mean, first we would, just back up a little bit. Like, who's your target? Is your target marketers? Is your target your clients? Is your target potential clients? Is your target, people who are going to be your clients in 5 years? Like, what is the, why is the podcast the vehicle, and like, what's the goal? But then, so say it's say it's a marketing company for small businesses, right? What do small businesses? So small businesses are so underrated, right? So meaning that they're like the salt of the earth people, they're in there day in and day out, and you're trying to market to these people that may not have more than $1,000 budget to start, $500 budget, a few $1,000s tops, right? If I'm that small business marketing company, I'm either going to be interviewing the small business owners and then giving them some free game off air, to be like, hey, if I were you, like, this is what one of our clients said, maybe you can try this out. And really just genuinely hearing their story, because you can tell if you have somebody on to try to sell them later. So generally hearing their story, or it's the small business marketing tactics podcast for mom and pop auto repair shops, right? We're going to make a cute name out of that, but say that's what we're going to do. All of the content then is basically our system just in podcast form. Mm-hmm. So everything's just value based, right? If the target is the people that you'd like to sell to, either now or eventually, right? Then your content is going to be things that they can go and use that work. So if I take Matt's advice from his LinkedIn post and I go and do it, and he says, connect with 10, 20 people a day who fit who you want to work with, and just comment on their posts. If I do that and it works, now I trust Matt for the next thing. Right. So now I go to Matt and I'm like, hey, man, what you said on your post works. But I want to take this to the next level. Now I'm going to pay you for your expertise because the first piece of advice that you gave me, it worked. Right. So that's it's that reciprocity. And I think that you can essentially give. I'm not saying, people always, they're like, give away the secrets and all this stuff. It doesn't have to be secrets. It can just be like the fundamentals of what people pay you for, the highlights. And then you have things in there that people can then go and actually use and try for themselves. Then the things that they try work, they're going to be your clients eventually, right? When they're done doing it themselves. I think you could give everything away for free, right? You could give people the world and they're still not going to do it because they're busy. They have a lot going on, right? They're still going to pay for it. So I think people shy away from kind of giving in terms of you almost want to feel like you're giving too much away, I think, personally. But that's just one example with this marketing company. I'm either going to be interviewing the people I want to work for and being genuine about it, or I'm going to be providing actionable advice that they can use,
Yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning a lot of things that you did. One thing I will mention is that often we're so in our own day-to-day that we don't realize some of the things we're doing actually are pure gold for someone else. It's really important to recognize is there's a lot of people in marketing. There's a lot of people in sales. There's a lot. Pick a topic, and what they do day in and day out would be extremely helpful to someone else, but we don't think it's incredible because we do it all the time. So that's one thing. Another thing, which was a concern of mine, which is also a concern of a lot of people, is they think they're going to run out of stuff to talk about. That does not happen. As you continue to unpack different elements with different guests, as you bring people on, you will recognize you can go deep, 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 deep into the concepts that you talk about. And there's so much that you can do. There are podcasters that have several hundred episodes out there. They do not run out of things to talk about. So if that's ever an issue, it's not something people need to worry about.
Thousands of episodes, many podcasts with thousands of episodes. You have to determine the difference between running out of things to talk about and you getting bored of the things you're talking about.
That is a very good point.
If you're getting
bored, very good point.
If you're getting bored, it's boring. So get out of there. Like, if you're bored, it's definitely boring. So that's kind of, and hey, listen, this happened with my own podcast. I'm at episode 105. I'm looking at my guest. I've had a ton of guests on, amazing in-person experience. It's been great. I've had a ton of people on who most people don't know who they are. And now I'm looking at, okay, is my interview skill matching my guest level, right? And so for me personally, like, yeah, sure, I'm the podcast guy or whatever, and I talk about podcasting every day, and I have one. But even myself, I'm thinking about changing things about my own show, right? This, you have to evolve. Like, you have to evolve, right? And, you know, there's a reason why these shows, they might not change the fundamental format, but the guests are changing, or the editing's changing, the post-production, the promotion, the way that they highlight, like, there's so many things. But yeah, I think if you're getting bored of the content, I mean, something has to change for sure. 100%.
That's a really good point. All right. So what about people out there that are saying, Ryan, you already talked about the work. You already talked about all these different things I have to do. I'm not at a place right now that I could do it. So let's talk about guesting, because I think this is a very underutilized business strategy, and I don't think enough people think about it in this way. You actually blew my mind a few months ago when you were talking about just the sheer strategy one can put behind guesting. So what we're talking about, for people that aren't familiar, is you not necessarily having a podcast yourself, but utilizing other people's podcasts to get your messages into the world. So let's talk about guesting. Where would people start in that regard?
Yeah, so where you want to start, like, if you've never been a podcast guest before, you know, you really want to start with getting the reps. I don't think like over planning and over strategizing it in the beginning is the way to go. In terms of trying to think of like, what's the thing that I have? You might want to just get on some lower level shows. And so if you can actually, there's multiple platforms that do this. Listennotes.com is one of them. They actually have a portion of their site that's dedicated to podcasters who are looking for guests, and it will signify, I'm looking for partnerships, sponsors, and guests, or I'm looking for sponsors and guests. These shows are putting it out there. That's just one way to do it. LinkedIn, I think, is also super powerful, and we can go into details there. But I think step one, get on some shows. Just get uncomfortable. If you're good in front of people and you're not nervous, great. But like most people get nervous, and that's good. It means you're excited. It means you want to do a good job. So I think getting the first few reps under your belt, right? Like, you're not going to watch a YouTube video on how to dribble the basketball. You're just kind of going to start dribbling it, you know? Like, you can kind of get the hang of it, right? So I think those first few times, just get the reps in there. Let the guest know, hey, listen, or let the host know, I haven't been on any podcast before. I really want to try it out. And this is what I'm thinking. And they're going to work with you, right? They might be early on too. So early on host, early on guest, that's a great way to start. Get your reps in. From there, we want to start thinking about, what value am I providing to the listener, right? If I approach Matt and I'm like, hey, Matt, I'd love to be on your podcast. I've done X, Y, and Z. That's okay. The next person comes, hey, Matt, I'd love to be on your podcast. Here's what we can teach the listener, X, Y, and Z, based on this experience. Who is he going to have on, right? So it's not as much about it's actually not about your credentials at all. It's only about the value that you could bring, I think, in my opinion, to a listener or a watcher or somebody that you're further along than. And that's the main angle that you have. You know, for me personally, like I said, I'm at episode 105. If you're at episode 15, I can probably have some game for you. But if you're at episode 3006 and you've been podcasting for 20 years, like, there's probably not much I can tell you, right? So it's not really about the credentials. I think it's really about framing your experience and then packaging it in a way that is that, you know, can help the listener, or if it's entertainment, then you're entertaining, if you're a comedian or something like that. But yeah, we're really looking in the lens of business here. I think starting with a few shows and then really taking a look at what can I provide on this podcast that is different than the next guy.
All right, I appreciate you mentioning that. One thing I do need to mention, because this happens all the time, and I want to save people from frustration, and I think there's a way that they could be more efficient with this, is, I'm sure you're probably the same. I get bombarded with messages with people asking me to be on this podcast, like daily, numerous times a day. Hey, can I come on your podcast? Typically when that happens, I actually have a message that I'll send back, and I'll say, thank you so much for reaching out. What podcast episode did you like the most? because more than not, they haven't listened to the podcast. They're just out there sending tons of mass messages. Now, sometimes people will get back to me and say, hey, I'll actually listen through and I'll let you know. That's going to give me a little bit more, maybe I should look into this person. Are they a good fit for my audience? But when someone reaches out and says, Matt, I loved episode number 12. I really appreciate what you said here. I actually do X, Y, and Z for people. I bet coming on your podcast, I could share this with your audience. The likelihood I'm going to give it a really good look to figure out, hey, is this a really good topic that relates to my audience? Is this really good for that belief system that you were talking about? More than likely, I'm going to have them on the podcast. So I just want people to recognize there's a difference between like mass messaging people, and there's a difference with being even more strategic about it, that it's more effective way to get on people's podcasts.
Great point. Great point. Same with me. I have a form that I make people fill out and a contract that they have to sign to. I own all of the content 100%. They can do whatever they want with it, but they can't remove it from the internet. And so that's also another thing too. Like, I'm, as much as I am on the guest side of things, like as the host, you're putting a lot out there. And so if you're reaching out as a guest to be a guest, just know that. A lot of times people are talking about their podcasts, the host podcast, but they're not interested in the host. The host is the person that's facilitating, right? But yeah, I say, hey, if you have a copy and paste message, great, use it. If it works, just don't make it sound or look copy and pasted. Like, I'm not against sending 100 cold emails to podcast hosts. I'm not against that. If there's just a level, if you're following these best practices. And like I said, I can't deny things that work, right? If you just if your strategy is cold emailing 3,000 hosts the same message, you're going to get on some podcasts. I know that works. That's just not my personal philosophy. But yeah, I think what you said is really important. And yes, most of these people are not. Imagine this. You can stand out as a podcast guest, potential guest, just by mentioning an episode. You don't even have to listen to it, Matt. I don't even have to listen to your episode 11. I can just scroll through the show notes and be like, really loved episode 11 because of this. Listen, I'm not telling people to like lie or like be deceitful. But the reality is, the extra mile for guests to be a guest is not a lot here. Like, most people are not good at this. And that's the thing. These are people who are C-level. These are people who have been in the X industry for a long time. They're not salespeople. They're not. If you're a salesperson, you're not going to have an ounce of difficulty getting booked on podcasts because you know how to sell.
Sure. I appreciate that. That is a ton of value. So Ryan, thank you for your time. We actually unpacked a lot more than I had thought, and I appreciate it. So typically I do top 3 takeaways. I actually have top 5 with this conversation. So I know there's a lot of people that got a lot out of this. Here's what I got out of it. So there's the top 5 things is I really appreciate in the beginning, you mentioned the work. So it's a lot of work, but it is high reward. I appreciate you being open and honest with us. The second part is people really recognizing their why. Not only professional why, but also personal why. That's going to continue to empower them to show up again and again and again. The third point, I love that you said the ideal listener, but from a belief system perspective, not a persona perspective, or at least deeper than the persona perspective, belief system versus persona. The fourth thing is I appreciate you mentioning, don't start with episodes in mind, start with ideas. It sounds super simplistic, but I think it's very high value. Start with ideas in mind. And then the fifth thing is the idea of being a guest, getting those reps in, starting with lower level shows, building up. You had mentioned listen notes that you can use that as a way to get on podcasts. There's a lot on there. I go on that site quite often, so I highly recommend it. But those are my top 5 takeaways. I bet other people got other takeaways. Those were my top 5, and I appreciate it. So in the event someone wants to learn more about what you do, they want to learn more about podcast principles, they want to connect with someone else on your team, where's the best place that they can go to get more information on you?
Sure. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate your takeaways, by the way. I really enjoyed this interview, really enjoyed this conversation. So if you're in like the 95% and you're just kind of looking at podcasting and you haven't made that full decision yet on launching one or not, I think following me on LinkedIn, connecting with me is probably the best bet, just because all my daily content is about this. And so it can really start to paint what I'm trying to do here is really paint a picture of reality. I think a lot of times we talk about, even, you know, in any interview you're going to do, you talk about high level things, but it's like, what's the practical, right? What do you actually have to do? So a lot of my posts are about that. My partner's post, his name's Jack Gallagher. He posts a lot about the numbers, statistics. If you're concerned with the market being saturated, definitely go connect with him. He's a big numbers guy. I'm more on the philosophical side of things. If you're ready to start a podcast or you think you're pretty close, you can head to our website, podcastprinciples.com. And the call to action there is just to book a call. So you can book a call with myself. I do run all of the partnerships and sales and marketing for the company, really on offense in terms of that. So you'd be speaking with me directly, and then we can, you know, see if it's a fit to move forward. But I think ultimately, really getting connected with me, I'm on LinkedIn every day. If you do use it, I'm on Instagram as well. But everything is podcast principles for the company. So appreciate it, Matt.
Perfect. To make it super convenient, I'll have that in the show notes. I highly recommend people follow Ryan on LinkedIn. I have for quite some time. And I will tell you, you post some really, really thought-provoking content pieces. Very, very helpful. Highly, highly recommend it. So with that said, thanks again, Ryan. I very, very much appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much, Matt, for doing this, man. Would love to do it again sometime.
Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. Please leave a review, since positive reviews will make it easier for others to find this conversation. Next episode will launch on Friday at 8 a.m. Eastern. Until then, remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to action, you must share more stories.